is a socialist who is a socialist from South Africa and is committed to the liberation and emancipation from South Africa to Palestine. She thinks that our movements for liberation and justice need to be rooted in an anti-colonial and anti-racist and anti-capitalist, and feminist. As for Brian, so we have in the room Brian Kamanzi, who is an energy policy research associate with the Trade Unions of Energy Democracy and a research consultant with Institute for Economic Justice. Brian has been working to provide technical policy supports for sections of the South African trade union movement around the world, around the just energy transition. And he is also committed to issues related to climate change, Pan-Africanism, and free education, among other issues. Welcome on board, Alex and Brian. Again, it's amazing to have you today with us. I had to turn out my camera for a bit because I'm in Lebanon. We have our electricity cut off every now and then. And I'll take also here the chance to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Al-Ghouta. I'm a feminist, civil defender, and human rights activist from Lebanon, and I'm a proud Middle Eastern activist who has joined Athar Network in the past 3 years and currently acting as the network program manager. And today I'm moderating this webinar on behalf of the regional coordinators team. So welcome again. To start, I would like first to ask you what brought you here today with us. Why have you joined Rhodes Must Fall? We would like to hear from you before I give an introduction about this very important movement. So I'll start with you, Alex. Why are you here today with us? What's your story?
Thank you, Sarah. I think this is an important discussion. It's been 10 years since Rhodes Must Fall, but I think it's also an important conversation to have at this political moment, given everything that has happened in the last 2 years in terms of the genocide, as well as the growing levels of fascism and right-wing emergence in many countries across the world and its impact on us in the global south. So an important way to build solidarity and learning with each other. So, and I think it's really important that we learn and learn together. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I look forward to learn from you today a lot. Brian, over to you. What's your story? Why are you here today with us?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Alex has said. And I think, when I first got the introduction and heard we were going to be speaking to some Palestinian students, as a South African, you just can't say no to that. So that part of it is quite simple and straightforward. We're in solidarity with what is taking place. It's unfathomable, completely disgusting, morally reprehensible, but also quite predictable from the perspective, the longer view of the historical development of the region. And of course, as South Africans, we recognize we have a different experience, but we have a parallel experience. And so I'm committed to being in conversation. And the thing I think I can maybe speak for Alex, I don't know. That's how we got involved in Rhodes Must Fall to some extent as well. It was a campus-based movement, and there were many parallel conversations happening. So there's many issues that people have, that are impacting their daily lives in a society that's so unequal. So it's really about meeting each other, understanding more, and then coming together because we recognize that we only tend to move forward when we do come together.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Thank you, Brian. So for dear attendees, I would like to give you an introduction about what is Rhodes Must Fall movement before we move into our discussion with our colleagues from the movement. So Rhodes Must Fall movement has started on March 9, 2015 as a protest against the statue of Cecil Rhodes, who is a British politician symbolizing colonization and racism, which was located at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. The movement successfully gained wide global attention, leading the University Council to vote on April 8, 2015 to remove the statue, and it was taken down the following day. The movement was not just a campaign to remove a statue symbolizing racism, but sparked widespread debate in South Africa, where public opinion was sharply divided over its goals and symbols. It also inspired similar students' movements at other universities, both within South Africa and abroad, giving it a place in global discussions about the legacy of colonialism, racism, and the role of historical symbols in shaping cultural identity. And also, the movement emerged in a historical and social context that reflects the ongoing challenges South Africa faces in dealing with the legacy of apartheid and the lack of fair representation of African experiences in education and society. I would like at the end also to mention that Rhodes Must Fall movement holds great significance in the global structure for social justice, highlighting the need to reassess history and cultural heritage in light of values of equality and inclusion. And it also reflects the challenges societies face in dealing with the legacy of the past and its impact on the present. And the movement has expanded to include broader calls for reforming the educational system in South Africa, aiming to remove the traces of colonialism from curricula and academic spaces. So while I'm saying the introduction, to be honest, I'm impressed again and again, although I have read a lot about your movement and dig deeper in it. And as you can see on the screen, these are some photos from the movement itself. So now I'll go back to you, Brian, to ask more about the political and social conditions that brought this movement to rise. So what were back then the political and social conditions that brought you to have this movement rise?
Great. Okay, I think just very briefly, I want to take a bit of a step back and say that the moment of coming together about Rhodes Must Fall was also about rethinking the story about the South African liberation story, right? And it's very important to think about who were the people at this institution at the time of Rhodes Must Fall 10 years ago, right? So prior to the early 90s, education in South Africa under apartheid was racially segregated, like everything else, right? And the University of Cape Town was a historically white university, and it was founded on the land that was, captured by Cecil John Rhodes, who you mentioned was a British businessman who was involved in mining, so deeply tied to the legacy of exploitation, dispossession in the region. But also, it was an elite white local university. After 1994, there were many things that happened that were important, and there were many reforms that happened that simply didn't go far enough. Simply put, South Africa is either number one or number two of the most unequal countries in the world every year. South Africa went through a process of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is often described a process of forgiveness without an apology. Is that and transitional justice without any redistribution, no restitution. So we have high levels of inequality. We also have a government-led process that was trying to reintegrate institutions and unify institutions. So they were supposed to be no longer white institutions, but institutions for everyone. The only way this would be made possible is by having financial subsidies for mostly Black working class students to enter into a whole range of university institutions, but including the white institutions as well. So at the student profile at the time of this protest was one that had the most, I suppose, in its up to its history at that moment. It had the most amount of Black working class students, Black middle class students, and everything in between, right? So I want to say that there has always been opposition. It was regarded as the university on the hill. There was always been opposition to what that university represented, what a city like Cape Town represents as being, one of the crown jewels of the white settler establishment. But it was when there was a critical mass of people of different experiences at the campus that you started seeing what were initially sparks turn into a fire. And that's what Rhodes Must Fall was. It was a fire. There were some activists who had come together. They had an idea about a protest that they were going to do on his statue. And Tumani Makwele was one of them. He collected human excrement, feces, from a portable toilet in a township about 20 minutes from the university and threw it on the statue. And I think the symbolism of that is quite straightforward in some ways. I think it is also quite powerful because the university also describes itself as being a very liberal institution. So they see themselves in some ways as being progressive. We're all about dialogue, we're all about inclusion. But of course, it is very much not that. Its method of communicating violence was one about really controlling the terms of debate, about explicitly excluding different types of ideas, different types of knowledges, and in essence, legitimizing the new South Africa, the post-apartheid South Africa, which is one that actually excludes the people who have been dispossessed. Is that you're only invited in if you don't contest the foundations of the country. But what every South African institution has encountered in the last 30 years, I suppose, is that as soon as you have the people who have been dispossessed in these rooms, they ask the questions, they elevate the questions that have been asked for 400 years. Who has the right to exist here? And if I am here, why can I not use these ideas and these knowledges and these resources to transform myself and my family's conditions? Why do people live in poverty? Why are the knowledges that you are teaching me don't describe my family history? Why is my language a vernacular and your language is a classical language, or something to be revered, or that's the gold standard for knowing English or literature? But African authors are something that you can only find in a bookstore, but not in a classroom. You also had Black academics who were on the campus, who some of them were involved in politics, but they were in working with cultural institutions on the campus, political organizations, and other parts of civil society, and they ended up linking with students. You also had worker organizations in South Africa. The worker movement in South Africa has a very long history of being involved in so many issues beyond just wages. It's been involved in issues about changing the country, international campaigns, including the Palestinian campaign. So it was also a campus. South African campuses are very much likely to have workers who are organizing for their own issues, who are also talking to student activists on a regular basis about what is happening in Palestine or what is happening in the mines in South Africa when there are issues, and that often tends to be a hotbed issue. So I guess what I'm saying is that this protest happened at a time where there were a lot of sparks. There was a lot of frustration and a lot of anger. And we essentially had the coming together of three groups. It came under a manifesto was developed through, there were various occupations that students embarked on. And occupation was very important as a method because it was also about centering the question about land and dispossession, capturing land on the university, occupying it and renaming it, and using names as a means to reclaim space and to think about a different future, and one that is not also restricted to what is talked about as post-apartheid South Africa. You're only allowed to view things in a certain ways, reclaiming parts of the resistance that have been excluded. But also it was about bringing together these three ideas. At the time, there were three groups, I would say. There's a Pan-Africanism, a Black radical feminism, and Black consciousness. And those ideas, they made their way into initial mission statement. I think, we all have different experiences in the movement. It was intended to be a non-hierarchical environment. So decisions were made in a plenary forum largely through committees and consensus. So if you talk to 50 people from Rhodes Must Fall, you'll get 50 different perspectives. And that was our strength, and that was also our weakness in some ways.
Yeah,
the
we'll
strength
we'll
element
dig.
of it, yeah.
Yeah, we'll dig
Yeah, yeah.
deeper later on the leadership part. But I want
Yeah.
Brian to ask specifically about the moment where one
Yeah.
of the students has got the trash toilet and threw it on the statue. Like,
Yeah.
what happened on? Can you describe what happened on that specific moment? Like, what was the reaction of the students on that specific moment?
Yeah, so there was a lot of outrage because it was seen as being like a very dirty thing to do. How could you also do that? It's an elite, clean space, and there's a lot of stuff about how people talk about white liberal universities. This concept of like clean and dirty is often also a euphemism for people. Sometimes some types of people are dirty, and some types of people are clean, and their spaces should be clean, but it's okay for ostensibly for Black people's spaces to be dirty. That's the subtext, right? So how could you bring that here? So I think that sentiment resonated with Black students on campus who saw this reaction and said, listen, what these guys are they're talking about us, or they're talking about my cousins, or they're talking about my friends, and this is enough. I've had enough, and I want to communicate something. I think the other side of the coin, though, the creative element, I think, is, and it's important to mention that because the space had sort of a vibrant activist community, both with workers and students and academics, is that there were ideas here about bubbling, about rethinking South African history, and thinking about colonization, not simply apartheid. Because there's something, and this is, I think, an interesting conversation to have with people from your region, is that there's sometimes something very limiting happens when you think about apartheid, because sometimes when you start with a diagnosis like this, it almost presupposes a certain type of medicine. Is that if you're looking for apartheid, then you must have the way to resolve apartheid is to apply pressure. If they fold, you will have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. People will heal, and then you'll all be one country, and everything's going to be great. We are saying, no, that's not possible. But also, how does that story sound when you tell it through the lens of the longer story of colonization? How does the story about people's liberation sound if you center colonization and not apartheid, or apartheid as being a simple an adaptation of colonialism, so to speak? So I think that was interesting, and I think that was that created a space for different types of people to get involved, come together, and start testing some ideas.
Interesting, Brian. Thank you so much. And I think it is a leadership story that is worth mentioning. I'd love to go to you, Alex. So I've heard from Brian that given the context back then, there were a lot of triggers. There was a lot of rage in the air all the time, and then this happened. And if I'm understanding properly, the movement has risen. So I would like to ask you, like after this specific incident, how the three groups or people in this movement came together, and how you were established to start doing tactics, putting your demands in place, and so on. So we'd like to know more about the movement dynamic in terms of structure.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly, if I can, just add something, because I think Brian touches on the different things that were at play, different triggers. And so, in the South African context, we had in 2012 the massacre in Marikana, which was a trigger moment for many people, progressive people in the country, to talk about how can this happen, 20 years into a supposed democracy. But also the year before, many of us were involved in organizing around Palestine. because of the Gaza bombardment with Operation Protective Edge. So many of us had begun to organize around Palestinian solidarity, whether it was in the form of an academic boycott at the university, but also particularly through the boycott of, or the demand for the end of the utilizing of G4S as a security company on the university campus. And so we had begun to organize and meet with the workers and the unions that were part of, that were working under this outsourced company called G4S. And so, you know, if there wasn't a response to Tumani Matlele throwing shit on the statue, it could have been a missed moment. It could have been a moment where he just threw shit on the statue. We were outraged for a bit, and that was that. And I sometimes think that is often not, we don't discuss that there was organizing that needed to take place in order for that to trigger a movement. And so, as Brian was saying, there were many students that then came together to meet to discuss, how do we take this forward? Because there were many responses within the university. There were some students who were organizing silent protests, having their mouth covered at different places. There were other students who responded by putting the symbol of the swastika around campus and saying, imagine this was in Germany or wherever else where the Holocaust had happened, how would people respond? It would be people would be very angry because it's a symbol of genocide, of Holocaust, etc. And others of us began to say, so what? How do we put pressure on the university? Because we had heard that Tumani and other students who had stood with him were going to face suspension and other repercussions by the management of the university. And also to discuss, what does this mean? Because we had different political views on what this meant. And so to say that, you know, the discussion about racism and etc., it didn't start here. And unfortunately, as Brian is saying, it has a long history, you know, within the university. And so some of us came together, and in the beginning, what we call the Student Representative Council, the SRC, had decided, let's organize there was a mass meeting where students came together to share their anger, their pain, their solidarity about what should happen moving forward. And the SRC then said, let's have a march to the administrative building of the university, and we'll stand outside, we'll read some speeches. And many of us said, that's not enough. Because we leave and then what? In that time, we had also been gathering, writing things. We created a small flyer to hand out, but we'd been meeting at various locations in the university to have protests. And in fact, at one of these protest actions that we had inside a building, a Zionist who was teaching Hebrew at the university violently stopped our protest, actually. So our link with the Palestinian solidarity is very, very strong. And so we had then also said, okay, let's occupy this administrative building so that we can begin to put pressure on the university. I don't think we imagined the way in which we were going to occupy on this Friday. And it was quite beautiful and poetic because they had locked the gates, and somehow, because we had mobilized a mass of students, of workers, of people in solidarity with our academics, we broke through the gates that they had closed and decided we're going to occupy. I think the university only thought that it was going to happen for a weekend and we would leave on Sunday, but weeks later we were still in this building. And the way in which we had organized ourselves, because I think students were also saying that the SRC, this representative body, could not make decisions on behalf of students, that we need to discuss as students, and we had, as Brian says, these plenaries. And these plenaries, and Brian can tell you, took hours. Sometimes we would meet at 6 o'clock and we would still be meeting at 2 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock because we were debating what our position was, whether it was in relation to how we were going to take down the statue. So some people were like, we need to pull the statue down. Other people said, we need to bomb the statue. We need to melt the statue, all of these things. And then there was also a politic saying, well, yes, there's the statue, but this is a much broader discussion that we are having about what is the type of university that we want to build and be in. And so what is the politics that is going to shape not only the movement, but the type of university that we're going to see. And then for many of us, it was saying, okay, well, the university is actually a microcosm of what we're saying we want to see, the South African society that we are trying to build. And so these conversations happened in what we call Azania House, and we invited activists, scholars, to talk about various questions. We screened a film around the anti-colonial struggles in Africa. We were discussing, we read a lot. We had reading groups where we were reading really important anti-colonial and decolonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon. We had very intense debates about feminism and the role of feminism. We were also had intense debates about racism and solidarity and what that looks like on the continent, but also in the global South. So these were really important discussions to shape.
Allow me, Alex, to interrupt you here and ask you a follow-up question to what you're mentioning, because I can imagine, like in big groups, when you start a plenary discussion, it might take ages to have a consensus on a certain decision. So I'm really curious to know about like how many people were in the room and how did you come up with the decision on the tactic that you are going to move next with. Because I can just imagine the situation and it's already like heavy.
At some point, we had hundreds of students in the room. And I think, so we also had to be, and in fact, we were called out at some point, some of us, because we knew that there were times when a decision was not going to come from this main meeting. And so we were caucusing or meeting in different corners, and the students would say, hey, you guys, you there in the corner, you think that we're stupid. We don't see that you guys are meeting and discussing and that you have taken particular roles on. Just come forward and say that you are having some of these discussions. And we also began to say that we needed to be a little bit more effective in how we were organizing ourselves. So we had to come forward, and they named this group of us and said that we had to include different stakeholders. So the SRC was there, and various other, so different political organizations, etc. And we called this group, STRAT, which was strategy, which was short for strategy and tactics. But it was in some cases where like a deeper discussion about the strategy and the tactics of how we were going to approach certain things were discussed. We also had a very important group called Media and Comms, which ran the Facebook page, which grew exponentially. We had at some point 25,000 followers or people who liked it. And we were corresponding with a lot of people and students across the continent. We had people who needed to organize food and supplies in the occupation. And then we had another group called Radical Action, which was the group that was going to organize if we were having a march or if we were going to disrupt an event, etc. There was an integral planning around how that was going to happen. And then we also had a group called the Intersectional Audit Committee. And it's often forgotten, but it was this group that, and there were very few people actually in this group, which was trying to manage questions around patriarchy and how we deal with that within the space of the occupation and the movement. So, you know, we were having very intense debates because we didn't all come from the same political background. Some were more Pan-African, Black consciousness, others were more liberal leaning, etc. And we had to try and meet each other, not always very well, to come to, and also to say that we were a horizontal structure in that there wasn't a chairperson, a vice chairperson, a president or anything. We had to in some way find consensus among ourselves as to how we were going to take a decision, whether we agreed all together or not, but that's how we had to organize ourselves. And I think in some ways that was really, really important. But also, as Brian has said, very, very difficult in terms of not only coming to a decision, but holding each other accountable for the decisions that we made, but also that we weren't able to act on. And so that was challenging. And also to know that, like from the first time colonizers decided we needed to deal with the native, management at the university knew and tried the same tactics of divide and rule. So they knew that a movement existed. They knew that we had a particular view, and then they would go around and try and meet with the SRC or other bodies to undermine what the decisions that came from the movement. And what we tried to do as the movement, along with the SRC, was to say it is really detrimental to the struggle of what we are trying to achieve at the university if we undermine this process. And it will be that management wins always. And that wasn't always very easy either, because it was also about power and who got to make certain decisions.
Yeah, I'll just have to get back to Brian on a question based on what you have mentioned, Alex. So, Brian, when you hear Alex mentioning the word we have done, we have did, we have sat, we have talked. So, if I want to ask you as part of this movement, who are you as we? Like, what brought you all together? What are the characteristics of your we? As hundreds of people staying in a room and putting like 5 to 6 hours just to get out with a decision. Yes, Brian.
You're asking a very complicated question, actually, to be honest. Because, okay, so I'll put it like this. It was a campus protest, right? And it was an occupation of a university admin building. However, there were many types of people that moved through the occupation. Activists from other parts of the city, activists from other parts of the country, sometimes visitors from elsewhere. And Alex is also mentioning some university groups were moving, some scholars and some activists were moving through. There was even a Black student movement from a nearby university about 2-hour flight from Cape Town, called the Black Student Movement. They spent several nights in the occupation at the university. So I will say that the "we" was always intended to be a bit ambiguous and a bit open-ended on purpose. Is that I think the main, I'll put my neck on the line and say the main agreement was that the space was for the liberation of Black people. And there are different understandings of what a Black person is and what it meant within the space. But I think that was the common understanding. Different types of people and groups could be in solidarity, but that was the main purpose, and that anybody could come into the space depending on the purpose. We also had, there was an education committee, which was one of the committees that were there. There were documentaries and there were reading groups, like she mentioned. There were even white students also from the university that came to some of these sittings. And there was a certain moment where white people were actually removed from the decision-making process within Rhodes Must Fall. And I think that was a turning point. I think that was an important turning point in that space, also because tends to be a certain way the direction of the conversation goes when you have white people present, in that it really, you always try to find a way to not make them feel offended, or their feelings of exclusion can become the center of the conversation, which is not necessarily the focus. So the removal of white people from the decision-making space opened up a possibility. There weren't really that many Black spaces on the campus. It opened up a possibility to have conversations with each other. And I think half of the reason the meetings took from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. was exactly that. People were spread across different departments. I was in an engineering department. Alex was in politics, philosophy, economics, right? I think that's what you were, and law. Yeah, and law as well. So, there was no other time in our lives that we had such an opportunity to talk about issues about the country until 2 a.m, other than what we were creating. And so there was also this excitement, and also without the view of somebody that you're worried about offending. You can be as wild as you want, and we're all at different stages of development. Some people, this is their life commitment, this is what they're studying. Some people, you're just learning about this stuff for the few time. Some of us were reading this in our spare time, and our main studies are in another area. But it wasn't in the best of times, it was a place that you could ask stupid questions. And the understanding was that you were part of a bigger family who have a common destiny. And so it's a long answer to your question, but just to say, we have a common enemy. We are unambiguous in that we oppose colonization wherever it is, because we appreciate that it is connected. And that also comes from the study of history, is that, the same people who developed the homelands in South Africa were also in the United States developing reservations. And obviously what happened in Palestine had a lot to do with how apartheid was conceptualized as well. And we know that these are not random events. They also map onto how people choose to make solidarities. Frans Fanon, who we were admiring and we were reading about, committed his life to fighting with the Algerian Revolution. So it is also about, the "we" is also about finding solidarity with people and finding a common cause with people who also aren't just like me. And I think that was also a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So yeah, I can sense like your spectrum of "we" is embracing the diverse students and the movements that were around you, but you had like certain values that are non-negotiable for people to be in these spaces, like ensuring solidarity, interested to learn about the history and others. I would like to take it from here and ask you, so I've understand from you, Alex, that sometimes decisions were not taken. It was participatory as much as possible, but sometimes it's not a full consensus of, among everyone because it's almost impossible. So the first time you decided to do a protest in order to advocate for the statue to be removed, did you notice that because the decision was not taken in full consensus, then the level of participation was less than expected? Like, how does such kind of tactics are translated on ground in terms of participation from the same people who were attending these long meetings and group meetings?
So just to say, before we had the occupation, there were multiple protests that were happening before we gathered in this way as Rhodes Must Fall, the movement. So, in fact, one of our first initial disruptions happened shortly after Khumani threw shit on the statue. And we disrupted a massive sports event that was happening at the university. It was a cycling event, and everybody who had finished the competition was meant to arrive where the statue was on our field. And we decided to run into this area and disrupt, and then to cover the statue again with black plastic bags. And I think people met us there, and we were discussing taking decisions at that moment in the meetings. But we were also meeting on the sides as various people from different groups around, okay, well, the event has to happen. Who needs to do what? So I think this idea that I think people understood that some of those things were happening on the side, but just wanted that there was an honesty in relation to the idea that these things were happening. And I think in hindsight, the transparency is really, really important in terms of accountability. I mean, I don't like the term leadership. I know, but I think everybody can play a leading role. And when we talk about leadership in that way, it means that, there are some people who are more, or who are smarter, or who are this or that. And I think what was really important about the committees that we created was that people who would not necessarily want to speak in a plenary because they didn't want to speak in front of 150 or 300 other people would be feeling safer to speak in an education subcommittee or in a media subcommittee, where they would make contributions and use the strengths that they have, whether it was to organize or to write or to, that was the other committee, the committee that I forgot, Brian, the writing committee, to write statements, or who could cook and think of how are we going to use 500 2-minute noodles to feed students, or what were we going to do with, when the supplies ran low, or who was going to talk to the workers, etc. So it was also finding ways where people felt more comfortable and could use their strengths, and I mean, it's not as if a movement isn't without challenge, because we're pulling and pushing against particular politics, trying to fight against being co-opted, trying to fight against various people with a particular agenda coming into the meeting. And so I guess, it's important, Sarah, that you're asking these questions, but I think it's also important to draw the lessons and what it means for your organizing at this moment, because I think
Yeah.
in many ways, there is much more at stake in your movement than at ours was. And I'm not trying to to say one is more important than the other. But I wanted to go back to this point that Brian had made about the decision that we had said about having no white people in the meeting. And it brought something to me over the last 2 years around the genocide, around the movement of Jews for free Palestine. Because what triggered us to say we didn't want to have white people in our movement is very similar to how I feel, and with all the great intention that Jewish allies have. It often feels that if they speak, like when white allies spoke, that it gives validity to our struggle, when our struggle should have validity with or without them. And that often their views around never again, it shouldn't have happened when the genocide happened to the Nama and Herero in Africa or in Congo, not just the Holocaust in Germany, where it wasn't only just Jewish people that were Holocausted. So it wasn't just some of my family members, but it was people who are communists, people who are disabled, people who are queer, people who are gypsies, etc. So that also gets erased. And it determines how the type of politics or whether violence, like the fact that we have to debate about the 7th of October for months and months. What about the 6th, the 5th, the 4th, and all the violence before then that was inflicted on Palestinians, on Lebanese, on Middle Eastern people by colonial imperialists like the Americans, etc. So it is also about you determining for yourselves what is the type of Palestine, what is the type of Lebanon or Syria, etc., without the noise of some of the allies. And I think that for me is really, really important. Because I think often that is lost. And I think we spent a lot of time talking about what we were trying to take down and not enough time about what we wanted to build up. And if that's something that I can reflect on in 10 years since, what does a free decolonized university look like? What does a free decolonized Palestine from the river to the sea look like? What does a free Lebanon, a free Syria look like? Without some of us saying, well, Assad is supported by, some people say Assad is supported by Russia and therefore we must support Assad. But Syrians are saying, it's more complicated. We want to be free and to determine. So for us, for me, the reflection is about how we organize or how we build. There has to be a thinking about what we were trying to dismantle and how we organize our tactics and a strategy towards that, but also how do we build at the same time for what we are wanting to see at the university. And so why I'm raising that is because this year, at the start of this year, we had students who were protesting very similar or the same issues 10 years later at the same university, and the university had co-opted the language of, oh, we want to have a decolonized curriculum. We want to include more. In fact, some of the academics that were with us protesting 10 years ago are now in the management of the university and are inflicting that violence onto students who are protesting now.
Yeah. So yeah, Alex, speaking about that, because thank you for taking me to linking it to what's happening around us here in the Arab world, and it's really important. Like it really flagged in my head that we spend a lot of time to take things down, but we don't spend enough time to think of how to build things up of our next future. But here, I would like to ask both of you before we move to the Q&A, if you had to go back in time and do something really differently that would benefit your movement and achieve all of your demands, because we know that some of your demands has been achieved, others are still not achieved. So if you have to go back in time and change something in the way you were organizing and working together as a movement, what would be in 1 minute? I'll start with you, Alex, and then to Brian. Yes, Alex.
I think when I look back, there wouldn't be many things that I would do differently, except that I think sometimes we focused a lot on the internal politics within the movement, which destroyed much of what we were trying to do, and didn't focus enough on who the actual enemy was. And so even today, this is the first time that I'm able to have a conversation, be in conversation with Brian, which shouldn't have been, it shouldn't have been that it's taken this long for us to reconnect and discuss this, because I think what we were doing 10 years ago was so important and could really, and in many ways shaped many young people to be building a different, and we could have, I think, gone a lot further.
Mm.
And so, and make deeper connections with the rest of the continent and the global south. And I wish we could have done that more and connected internationally around a strategy to organize. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer a lot. And the thing is, it's funny because when the statue was removed, to be honest with you, it was a very sad moment, because that was the beginning of the capturing of the story and the normalization of the defeat. Basically, is that when we came together, we realized that in order for us to have that vision that Alex is talking about, we needed to give up a lot of things. We needed to basically chart a different direction. We were like slowly getting to that conclusion. And so removing the statue and the process that the university started after that was basically the beginning of the defeat, the defeat of that protest. And I think, when Alex talks about seeing students protest now, and also for some, there ended up different, if you can say, factions within the movement. What makes it so difficult even for us to talk to each other now in 2025, 10 years later, is how painful it is that these issues are still left on the table. And that if you really care about what's going on, I would even say to some extent it's like embarrassing. It's like we did a lot of things, certain sacrifices were made, but also we didn't take it to its proper conclusion. And that I have a lot of, if I could go back, I wouldn't change anything per se, because things happen the way they do for a reason. But I would say, I would take away from that, like, I wish if I was ever in that moment again, I wish I would be a little bit more brave to, like Alex was saying, to say, I actually do think this is the enemy, and 1, 2, 3 needs to be done. And we may have issues with each other, but that's what I actually think. So I think that's my takeaway. I also do think that one of the big roles of young people is to also experiment and test boundaries, and not necessarily to be perfect. So messing up and failing is a big part of politics, and a big part of growing and learning. And many of us know, we don't necessarily engage, but we know where we are. And sometimes you see, I know some, like Alex has been involved a lot in the environmental mining movement. And there's certain places that, when I heard that this event was happening, I said, we need to talk to Alex, because Alex was talking on campus about Palestine when this was only an issue that I was kind of just familiar about. And that's, I think, when I think about the future of the country and the place where we want to build, it's like those two parts. It's about remembering to be braver, but also to some extent, you do have to think about we have to know each other and we have to trust each other, and we have to, like, the struggle is a permanent one. It doesn't end at the fall of apartheid. It doesn't end when people have the right to vote. It doesn't even end when eventually Palestine is a sovereign, properly, fully sovereign country. It's a permanent struggle. That's history shows at the end of the story of the apartheid liberation movement, the end of the apartheid is exactly that. Elon Musk, in fact, I wanted to actually say it in the introduction, but Elon Musk is almost like he is a continuation of Cecil John Rhodes in so many ways. They're very similar. They're also making very similar partnerships. And so I feel like it's so much in the same vein of saying it's easier for us to take down versus it is to build. It's like we know that the other enemy is doing this, but for whatever reason, it feels very difficult for us to build the ties with each other, both in our countries and internationally, in the same way that was done in the past. And I think we need to get there, but there's a human element to it as well. It's like, it's one thing to say we're in solidarity with each other. It's another thing for us to know each other and to, and to be really in community with each other. And that's the good and the bad and the ugly. It's like because our lives are messy. And as a joke, as soon as you kick white people out, one of the biggest things that came with that is that we've got to face ourselves, because then the conversation also isn't all about how a white person was racist to you. It was now like, okay, maybe I'm a bit of a misogynist, or maybe whatever. There's so many different ways you could slice it. We have to face ourselves. We have to know each other. We have to be a bit more brave, but we can't go back in time. Everything happens for a reason, and we have the future to win.
I just wanted to add something, Sarah, because I think for me this is a really important moment, just interpersonally, also with Brian, because this hasn't been it's a much long overdue conversation, and I think it's important that in even 10 years later we can recognize that, like, I hope I can still identify the enemy and know that actually Brian is a person, or these are the comrades that I would want to continue to be in struggle with, because I know very much for many of us, we are still continuing to fight for Rhodes to fall in various shapes and forms, whether it's in relation to the crisis of energy or extractivism or the environmental crisis. And I do just want to lastly say that you have to draw lessons from the political transition of South Africa to shape what you want to see as independence, as liberation in your own countries. Please do not think that what we have here is just amazing. Apartheid has come to an end. In fact, much of what we thought would happen has not unfolded, and we are having to build or reshape what this country should be. And so in many ways, I think we see the similar issues, whether it's in Palestine, around how people feel in relation to the PA. Many feel the same in relation to the ANC in South Africa, in relation to how much further can we push and demand for what we want, and to not have to negotiate with those Israeli settlers to determine what your society and what your freedom and liberation should be.
Yeah, but here, because Awashi, thank you so much for your reflection and very open and honest reflection. To be honest, I can definitely relate that these moments where we have a conclusion that yes, we have achieved a lot, yet it wasn't enough at the time. However, given you have mentioned that people are still and students are still demanding in the universities, and we all or most of us have known that this movement have influenced a lot of other movements in the world. So where is the movement now? Like I strongly believe that people like you and the groups that you have formed have not stopped the struggle, and they are keeping on achieving change in a way or another. So I would like to know, like, where is the movement today, and how does it help in building up the current movements in the university right now? Because you know the context is really complicated. It's there are really strategies to fail our attempts every now and then, but I think real believers in change don't stop, even if it's not in the same pace.
So it's a difficult, and it's also not a difficult question to answer. The movement as it was in 2015, 2016, unfortunately doesn't exist. And I would also say that what we tried to do as a way in which, I don't know if I can even call it I do think it was a strategy to undermine the question of power or opportunists wanting to use this for a political party. We had it was almost like a front of students who had come from different political orientations, mostly and we had said that we were nonpartisan, so we were not affiliated to a political party. And that was a very important at that moment to build a unity among the different interests that existed at the university. So whether it was students, whether it was workers, whether it was academics, but also the various political parties or organizations that people were members of. And that the ultimate goal was much more important than the interests of these groups. And I think that's also an important lesson to draw from, because what we are seeing at the moment at the universities is that there's an inability to organize broadly because people are so divided by the color of their t-shirt or their political badge that they are not able to come together in the ways in which I think we were able to do at that, not without challenge, and not that we had to manage that really well. But I think that was an important way to organize, but also to find the threads that linked politically beyond our own interest at the university. So it wasn't just about what we wanted to just see at this university, but we could link it to a broader politics of decolonization, of anti-capitalism, of decommodifying education, which I think in many instances at this moment should be linked to questions that we are seeing of austerity or the cutting of budgets of a neoliberal budget and economy. And I hope that students are then able to draw that in the same ways we have to see that we have to organize, given that there is a rise in the right and a rise in fascism. And if we don't unite to see what's happening geopolitically, we won't be able to be in solidarity or to defend Palestinians or Lebanese, etc., when there is a further attack by Trump, Musk, the Germans, et al.
Would you like to add anything, Brian, before we move to the questions?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that, we spent a lot of time on Rhodes Must Fall. Later that same year, there was a big fee strike across the country. It was also, this one wasn't necessarily fully national, but it was linked to, the fee strike was linked to the worker demands on campuses. And that had some connections to other parts of the economy where students and workers were linking up. And you started to see more student activists enter into civil society. And in South Africa, politics, a lot of politics is driven, progressive politics is coming from parties and then civil society and trade unions. So I think the movement by name does not exist. There's so many people, many of whom have never even met each other, from all over the country, who experience this moment and these ideas, and they have that shared moment. Since if the older generation had the fall of apartheid and the experience of apartheid to reference with each other, in the context of shared struggle, this I think was one of the moments in the post-apartheid era for young people to say, look, I was a part of that. I know so and so. These people were part of it. My cousins were also fighting for free education, so on. It's a moment to use. It's resources to use to think about something else, participating in something else, envisioning something else. So I think that part remains. The other side of it, though, is that as the older generation dies and the new comes into being, is that we also are soon to be having the opportunity to also be the villains. And I think some of that is already taking shape a little bit. I'll say that. I don't think that you don't come out of these experiences necessarily. We don't all come out with the same conclusions and the same. We walk out with different lessons. And I think we take things like repression. One of the things that I feel that the lesson that came out of basically brutalizing students all over the country, brutalizing workers, was that I feel many people walked away from that experience thinking, okay, so if you have power, you can basically determine the truth. Because most people in South Africa, I'll put my neck on the line and say most people agree with free education. But we know we cannot agree to free education because I have the power to make that statement the truth. So I feel that we were disciplined into that lesson, and that has potentially some dangerous there's some dangerous things about our generation for the future, about what we took away from that moment. Like maybe we will enact our version of freedom in a very unforgiving way. And maybe we will be very similar in some ways. And I hope that I hope we can find each other and continue to grow and not want to, because this is, as we were reading Fanon and all of these things, these are not like new discussions. But we definitely even saw it within the context of a small student protest. There's certain ways in which we started to emulate the very same people that we were fighting against, because it turns you, fighting against your enemies turns you also a little bit into, it morphs your body. You become a bit nasty. You are somebody who, maybe you were a medical student who just cared about like helping people. Maybe that was as a young person, that was your feeling. Now you got involved with all these crazy Marxists and Palestine people. Now and that's it's one of those things. So I think the future is very much up for grabs, and I think that we are very much at risk of being the bad guys, and not only the Musks and the Trumps.
Allow
me. Sorry, Alex and Brian.
Brian said 10 years ago, actually. He said that watch out. Probably in 20 years' time, some of us will be in these positions of power and the big sellouts. And in fact, we haven't even had to wait 20 years. Some of the people who were in the struggle with us are sitting in big positions of power within companies or within government, and are making decisions that are detrimental to the struggles that we were fighting.
Thank you so much, Alex and Brian. I'm aware of the time. We still have 15 minutes. But because I want to close the discussion on a note, as an activist hearing you, I would like just to highlight the idea that your work or the movement work has built cumulative incidents and events that we can learn from as activists if we want to create a change. So thank you for all the efforts that you have put along with colleagues to conclude lessons from this movement that has definitely left important impacts. I know that you have self-criticized and reflected today, and I really appreciate it, but I believe like experiments and group and personal experiments built up all over time in order for all of us to learn from if we want to learn. I'll go now to the questions. Jomana, my colleague, can you help me with picking up 2 or 3 main questions from the Q&A that
Of
wasn't
course.
answered? Yeah.
Of course, Sarah. There's a question that goes back to the tactics, and it's more about how purposeful. How did you use the media to build on the success of the campaign? Maybe we can start with that, Sarah, and then we can move to things that are more on a different note.
Yeah. Brian or Alex would like to answer?
Okay, I can start on this a little bit quickly. So there's 2 parts. The one is that we just so happened that there were so many really crazy creative people in the space. And so they were in some ways let loose. They had a lot of them had their own ideas. They self-organized at some of the committees, but art was a very big part of the protest. And so I think over time there became a way, and that is something that's not separated out from generalized like protests that happen in South Africa about incorporating music, elements of public art in protest. That was happening. So you had people who were almost in a way they were like interpreting the protest through their art in the actual march. And I'm making it sound more complicated than how it actually plays out. But that's also something it's not abnormal to happen. So when that's filmed by the journalists, or when we post that on our Facebook page, it carries a story, even if sometimes, because there's sometimes, like Alex is saying, sometimes there's 150, 300 people. Other times when, they've successfully made us look like crazy people, there's like 10 or 15 people, and art is really good at that. The second part of it, though, very quickly, is that also the thing that happens when you bring in people who are not meant to be in these Western institutions, when you start bringing in all of your stuff, it's automatically disruptive. You start bringing in elements of you start asking crazy things like we should bring our full selves into the space. Crazy things start to happen. We start bringing things from our spiritual traditions, from our cultures, from our food. There was even an instance with one celebration where a sheep was slaughtered on campus for a marriage celebration. And that caused a whole thing. I know for some people that's quite controversial, for others that's quite normal. But it was quite a destabilizing activity, especially in an institution that sees itself as a very like white, civilized, clean place, So those like finding ways to present that in media was a good way to connect with other people who feel excluded by these spaces, but also to, especially when numbers were low, to amplify power.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Jomana, please, another question.
Just quickly to add, what we saw, which was very similar to what we saw happening at US universities last year, was that we had in 2016 erected what we call shacks. A shack, which is like a tin house that the government thinks is what people should live in who are poor in this country, which we were protesting against. And it was a way to bring people to the protest and to draw attention to the question of the housing crisis that we were raising on campus, in the ways in which we saw it unfold last year in the occupations on the US campuses.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you for adding up. Jomana?
There's a question about what they think feminism feminism had as a role in the movement?
Yeah, has feminism played a role in the movement? This is my favorite question, Romana.
Well, you see it with Brian at the moment because it's a shared responsibility of care work, etc. So feminism was critical to the movement. And many people would say that that's where the first divisions came into the movement. But I think, and this idea that feminism is a Western concept was also something that we challenged vehemently in the movement. So in fact, actually, there's an Egyptian feminist, Al Sadawi, who always talks about the fact that feminism is not a Western invention. It is something that was created here in Africa and is part of how we think about how we root care, how we root justice, and challenging oppression. And we were just saying that it wasn't just about the question of race, but it was about the question of equality between gender, no discrimination in terms of your sexuality, and knowing that all the work that we do in our homes, etc., has to be valued to the work of thinking and talking on the mic, and that anybody should be able to do that, irrespective of who they are. And so it was a critical politics that drove and built the ideas of what justice and liberation was for the movement. And I see that not being in conflict with many of the struggles in the Middle East, because women and many feminists have been at the center of ideas around what a free Palestine would look like.
Thank you so much. I can't take more questions for the sake of time. Thank you a lot for your time. I can read on the Q&A a lot of participants mentioning in Arabic that they respect the efforts that you have put. It was brave from you and it was powerful. It is very clear what brought all the students clear, especially when it comes to solidarity and unity. And a lot have written about your activism. They are appreciating it and they are saying that this is well respected, and they are thanking you for your time to come and share your experiences and be this honest and transparent. I would like to conclude before I have listen like a final word in 30 seconds from both of you. But from from where I come, I believe that every discussion or every conversation is a learning opportunity for me as an activist living in such complicated context. And today I have learned a lot from you, but I'll mention some of you because there are plenty. Like I've written 5-6 pages of notes while you were talking. So the first point that I have learned is, as an organizer, to be aware about the noise of the allies. And this has brought my attention when you have mentioned the issue of white people and how this might undermine our causes in a way or another, taking the leadership from the original people, like the people of their own cause. So to be more aware as organizers of the noise of the allies and act accordingly and smartly on how to embrace having allies, but without having them disrupt our movement or our struggle. The second learning point for me is that always building relationship with people in the movement and in our campaigns is key to ensure the presence of a human element and to ensure that our struggle is permanent and not a temporary one. And this should be also done through praising ourselves instead of judging ourselves. So thank you so much for being this transparent and teaching me this lesson. And the third point that I've learned today from this webinar is that it was really eye-opening that the first act that happened when shit was thrown on the statue could have stopped there, but because there is already organizing in place to trigger the movement, that's why the movement has risen through time. So there was consistency and patience, and also there was a structure in place, and we need to invest in the current existing structures in place if we want to build upon opportunities or incidents that are happening around us. So thank you so much today for reflecting and discussing with us. I have personally benefited from this webinar and grateful for this moment, to be honest. And I would love to hear your final words before we close. So I'll give it over to you, Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciated this opportunity. As also, as Alex is saying, this was as much an opportunity for us to talk as it was to share with all of you. And I do want to just say that I do think there's a serious attack on us and our ability to understand ourselves on our own terms. There is a argument that is being made, I'm sure you have seen it, to say that maybe like a Palestinian issue is a Muslim issue or an Arab issue, or that Arabs were involved in the slave trade, so you can't care about it's inappropriate to make a Palestine apartheid language. There's elements about the way that propaganda is transforming, that is picking up on things, that is gaining its, how can I put it? There are weaknesses within our movement. There are people in our own context who care about issues, let's say in Palestine, but they don't care about what is happening to their neighbor. There are also issues in the fact that we don't focus as much on building people-to-people relations as we do about big political ideas. So I think these kinds of things are very important. It's important to have places are not ideas. Palestine is not an idea. South Africa is not an idea. Apartheid is not an idea or analogy. It is an experience. People need to know each other and feel that we have some kind of common and shared stake in the future, and that we want to go to the same place. But also this idea that it's possible for me to care about somebody else who's not from my group. That is something, that question doesn't actually it's often centered around white people. It's got nothing, white people is a very small part of the world. The most explosive thing is when people in the global south try to be in solidarity with each other across lines of difference. It is a very difficult thing to do, and they always try to attack that. So at every opportunity, we need to find new ways to do that, break bread with each other, and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Alex?
Thank you so much. Again, it was a really important opportunity to be in conversation with an old comrade, but also with all of you. And I hope, as I said to you and Salwa when we met last week, that this is one of many conversations that we have. Because I think, as Brian is saying, the Zionist force, the white supremacist, fascist force finds new ways to attack how we are building solidarity. So I can remember when we had Israeli Apartheid Week after Rhodes Must Fall, they brought an Ethiopian soldier and a Muslim Palestinian from the 48 to say, but there's no discrimination happening here. We are all together. We all support Israel. And they were using a strategy that came from our organizing to try and defeat the ways in which we had built solidarity and were challenging narratives around colonialism, imperialism, Zionism, and its connections with white supremacy, or at the heart of it being white supremacy and fascism. And so what we need to be doing now more than ever as young people is building solidarity across the global south, learning from each other, organizing and building together. And so I hope this is to you, as the organizers, that we can find ways to bring other young people from across our continent, from the Middle East and other places, to come together to have more discussions and to say, how do we build together, and
Yeah.
to fight what's happening in the world.
Exactly. And from your word, Alex, I would like to conclude this webinar with saying this is only the start of our communication. And we are going to sit together and explore further what we can do and open it up to all our audience here as well, who are interested to know more about your experiences and share also their experiences. We have in our audience people from Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Tunis, Morocco. So this is a very diverse attendance today in this webinar, and I'm proud to have spoken to both of you. We'll keep the connection up, definitely. It's much needed in these dark moments of the world, and we need to have our efforts also united. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks for the technical and support team for making this webinar happen. And also thanks for all those who attended today. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Keep fighting and keep struggling.
Definitely.
Yeah.
ورمضان كريم على الجميع يلي عم
Yes,
بيحضروا. إن شاء الله
Ramadan
يكون.
Kareem.
Thank you. Bye-bye.